Before I go back to the topics that we were talking about, we're in the middle of lecture 2 as we start lecture session 3. It occurs to me as we're singing that we're having a small experience of triune life right there in our singing together. This doesn't fit into anything that I had prepared to talk about, so I'll just add a lengthy footnote here about one of the most interesting and fruitful books on Trinitarian theology recently is Jeremy Begbie's book, Theology, Music, and Time. Begbie is a concert pianist. He conducts. He has a position at Cambridge, I think, and also at Duke University over in the States. And if you've ever seen Begbie, he has a shtick that he does where he will lecture on theology, whatever theological topic, and then he'll sit down at the piano and play something that illustrates musically what he's been talking about, and then he'll get up and lecture some more. And it's quite a show he can put on. It's very lively and entertaining. But the goal of Theology, Music, and Time is not to provide a theology of music. He's not trying to analyze music from a theological angle. Rather, he's using musical categories in order to talk about theological topics. And as the title suggests, he spends some significant time talking about Trinitarian theology, trying to use musical categories, and makes the point that when we think in spatial terms, think in terms of visible objects, we have a really hard time making sense of Trinitarian concepts. God is one and yet three persons. I'm not going to talk about it today, but yesterday I talked about perichoresis. I can bring that up if you're interested in hearing more. Perichoresis is the name that's given to, it's a technical term that's used to describe the reality of the union of the Father and the Son, particularly the union as mutually indwelling. So Jesus talks about this in John's Gospel several times. I am in the Father is in me. Each of them indwells the other, and that's the word that's used to describe that reality is perichoresis. You think of spatial objects, that's really difficult to conceive of, that something can be both inside and outside at the same time. And Begbie is arguing that if you use musical analogies, and you recognize their analogies, they're not identical to the reality of God, but if you use musical analogies, then you cut through some of those difficulties. So is it possible to have two physical objects occupying the same space at the same time, fully occupying the same space? Well, no. The answer is no. Is it possible to have musical objects occupying the same space at the same time? That is, can you play a piano and not only have me sing, but each of you singing, and that each of you is making a sound, certainly Steve at the piano is making a sound, that fills the whole space, and yet that space that's filled with the sound is also occupied by the sound you're making, which also fills the whole space. And you have this harmony of different voices that create this one sound that Begbie develops that idea as an image of Trinitarian theology. It has some analogies with things that wonderful things that Jonathan Edwards talks about. When he thinks of the harmony of heaven, he thinks of people, a company of people sweetly singing. The unity of heaven is people sweetly singing. And I could feel that. I felt Trinitarian just a moment ago. In the sense that I'm singing, you're singing, our voices are combining. But I'm sure you've had this experience. I was having a little bit of this experience just a moment ago. Some strong singers behind me, and I begin to sing better. And there's a physical reality to that, right? Because their vibrations from their voices, a really strong singer can kind of vibrate through my body and make me a better singer. Okay? So our voices are combining, but our voices are combining partly because we're sharing this sound together, and we become one complex choir that's singing the praises to God. That's a little glimpse of Trinitarian life that I think that we have in creation, and it's a beautiful thing. Thanks, Steve, for that song. That was wonderful to sing along with you. So, we're talking about person and substance, and let me get back into that. As we continue our second session. I set up the issues before lunch. The issues have to do with both essence and person and the complications of defining those terms in a Trinitarian context. Different sorts of criticisms brought against each of those. Essence, it's charged as a philosophical term that doesn't really fit in Trinitarian theology. It's too static a category to be a good description of how God is one. Person there's a complicated history of how that word is used at different phases of Trinitarian thought. And also, especially in the contemporary world, there's discussion about how the word person is being used in Trinitarian theology in connection with how it is used in common modern parlance. How does it mean the same thing or anything close to the same thing that it meant in our common language and in Trinitarian theology? Are those analogous at all? Sometimes this is presented, and I'll just say a few words about this. Sometimes this contrast between, or this discussion of essence and person is presented in terms of a contrast between Eastern and Western Trinitarian theology. Eastern Orthodox theology on the one hand and Western theology on the other. You take the Cappadocian theologians of the 4th century who formulated the classic Eastern doctrine of the Trinity as the representatives of that Eastern tradition. Maybe Augustine and Aquinas as the representatives of the Western tradition. And the argument is that there's this fairly significant gap between East and West. Sometimes it's presented this way, that the East emphasizes the persons, and the West tends toward an essentialism that emphasizes the one God. The East begins with three persons, and then asks the question, how can these three persons be one God? The West begins with one essence, and then it asks, how can this one essence exist as three persons? So you have a supposed contrast between the plurality that's emphasized in the East and the unity that's emphasized in the West. And that's become a pretty common way of setting up Trinitarian problems. I think that's deeply, it's profoundly oversimplified. First, because of the cross currents between East and West in the early centuries, at least, before the break between the Eastern and Western churches in the 11th century. Even though not all Western theologians could read Greek or vice versa, you still had interaction between the two, and you did have theologians that could speak both Greek and Latin on both sides. So it's not as if they're ignorant of one another's work. And it's also, the contrast is not that is not stark in the way that's presented. That serves the interests of different sorts of theologians. If you are an Eastern theologian and you want to you set up the terrain so that the West is emphasizing the one essence of God, and you're advocating for the three persons, then you can accuse the West of being kind of proto-modalist or verging toward Unitarianism or not quite Trinitarian. And vice versa, the West can construct the terrain so that they can throw, say, launch bombs over to the other side of the boundary. When in fact the boundary is not nearly as clear as that. And the fact that the idea that there is such a boundary is actually a fairly recent paradigm in historical theology. I won't take time to summarize this in any detail, but if you want to look into this any, Michel, M-I-C-H-E-L, Michel, the French name, Michel René Barnes. I haven't figured out nationality here because Michel and René, I'm on a path for something other than Barnes as his last name. I don't know how Barnes comes into that. Maybe he's French Canadian. I don't know. Michel René Barnes has written a number of articles on kind of the history of Trinitarian discussions in the modern world, and he has an article on Theodore de Regnan, who is the writer from the 19th century who first developed this paradigm, sharply contrasting the East and the West. And once Deregnon had said this, everybody begins to take it for granted. They don't go back and investigate the sources that Deregnon used. They don't even know that Deregnon's paradigm is the one that they're using. This is just becomes part of the air that they breathe, and everybody thinks that way. And Barnes, it does a really good job of kind of stripping, peeling back, digging back into this original, the original writer who set up this paradigm, and showing that it's not. This is not really things are far more complicated than that. It's not really an entirely helpful way to think about the differences, different approaches to Trinitarian theology. That's not to say there aren't any differences between East and West. It's not to say there aren't any differences among individual theologians. There certainly are, but he's trying to undermine that simplistic paradigm. And I bring that up mainly because if you read any Trinitarian theology, you'll come across that paradigm. A lot of people operate in terms of that. Mea culpa. I've said things like that until I read Michel Rene Barnes, and then I try to avoid it, although, gee, it's so tempting and so simple sometimes to set things up that way. So Michel Rene Barnes, I don't have the title of the article, but he's written a couple of articles on that topic, so look into that if you're interested in following up. So I want to address the questions about substance or essence and person. The first talk about substance a little bit, and this is something that I talked about on Saturday. I apologize to those of you who've heard this just a couple of days ago, but I find it a helpful way to get into that question. And get into it by way of Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, working with a Christianized version of Aristotelian metaphysics, and it is, just as a footnote, it is a Christianized version. He rejects those parts of Aristotle that aren't consistent with Christian confession, or the ones that he can identify as not consistent. When Aristotle says things that imply an eternal creation, Thomas says that can't be right, so we have to revise the metaphysics. Transubstantiation, looks like it's Aristotelian. That's what Luther thought. Now, this is the captivity of the Eucharist to Aristotle. It's an Aristotelianization of the Eucharist. But Aristotle wouldn't have recognized the possibility of a substantial change that didn't change the accidents of the thing, which is the miracle of transubstantiation. So Thomas believes in transubstantiation. He's using Aristotelian categories, but he's asserting something using those Aristotelian categories that can't happen in a strictly Aristotelian universe. He says, also says things like, this is getting directly into the point I want to make from Thomas, that everything, according to Aristotle, is a combination of form and matter. You have the stuff of which something is made. It can be a metaphysical stuff like human nature. It can be physical stuff like wood. And then there's a form that informs it or is imposed on it, and that makes it a particular substance, a particular thing. So the combination of form and matter makes a particular thing. You have basic formless matter, and then you inform it with different forms that makes that's what makes the kind of world that we live in, the things of the world that we live in. But on Aristotle's understanding, you can't have anything like a pure form. And Thomas disrupts that too by saying, well, angels are pure form. They aren't made up of any material thing. And so, again, he's disrupting the Aristotelian metaphysics. But he also disrupts it by the way that he talks about essence and existence. Form and matter it's a combination of those two principles that makes a substance. A substance is an individual thing, for Aristotle at least. You combine form and matter and you get a particular thing. You also combine, you also have a composite of essence and existence that makes a particular thing. Okay? The essence of something is the kind of things that it is. You could think of it as a description of the nature of the thing and the attributes of the thing. For Aristotle, the fact that there is an essence implies the existence of that thing. On the basis of the doctrine of creation, Thomas Aquinas disagrees with that. And he says that you can have the essence of something without having it actually in existence. We can illustrate this with imaginary things. We can describe imaginary things. The play last night that I saw is still on my mind. It was a great performance. I saw Pericles, king of Tyre. Pericles, king of Tyre, I don't know if that character actually existed in history. The events that it describes didn't exist in history. The character, as Shakespeare presents him, is a literary character enacted by an actor on the stage. But that's a fictionalized character. Even if he existed at some point in the past, he's still fictionalized by Shakespeare. And yet I could discuss the character of Pericles, what kind of person he is. I can tell you how he reacts to his adversities and tries to overcome them. And I can tell his story. I know a lot about his life. I watched it last night. But he doesn't exist. So I can talk about the essence of Pericles and I can describe him in some significant detail. I'm not implying that he exists in actual historical reality, but I can still know something about his essence. So essence and existence are distinct realities. When they are combined, when essence and existence combine, then you again have a particular substance. But it's the combination of those two things that makes created things real. But Aquinas says that that's not the case with God. God is not a combination of anything, any components. He's simple. You don't take omnipresence, a dash of omnipotence, a cup of righteousness, 3 large dollops of love, and make God. Okay. God is all of his attributes. He's not a composite of anything. And he's not even a composite of these metaphysical principles of essence and existence. Thomas resists the idea that you can talk about God by combining these philosophical ideas. Even combining philosophical ideas would be an affront to the simplicity of God, according to Aquinas. So God isn't essence plus existence, but rather his existence and his essence are identical. His essence is his existence. Excuse me. Now, what does that have to do with Trinitarian theology? It was kind of fun to talk about, I thought, but what does that have to do with Trinitarian theology? I think what it implies is this, and this does get to the question of substance and person. If God's essence is his existence, we know his existence is existence as Father, Son, and Spirit. We confess the Trinity. We're saying that that's how God is. That's his actual life as God. But if his essence is his existence, then his essence is his life as Father, Son, and Spirit. Okay. So that avoids the idea that there's any kind of fourth thing that's behind or underlying or that is the real God that's hidden behind the 3 persons. There is no other God but the 3 persons in their life together. That existence as Father, Son, and Spirit is the essence of God. So when we use substance or essence in that way, which Thomas might not exactly assert, but it seems to be implied by the logic of his argument, that these 2 things are identical. If that's the case, then we can talk about substance, but we're no longer talking about this kind of underlying stuff, no longer talking about bare divinity, bare divine stuff, that is naked divine stuff. Quality-less divine stuff without the quality of Father, Son, and Spirit and their relations and love and life together. We can't talk about divine substance in that way because the essence of God, the substance of God, is his existence. Okay, that's an example, I think, of what I said earlier about Athanasius, that you have the gospel summarized in Trinitarian theology, Christian theology that is transforming what we mean by the philosophical terms that we use. because that's not what Aristotle would have meant by substance or essence. But it is what Aquinas means when he says essence is existence. He's saying the essence is the existence of Father, Son, and Spirit together. So that means that we can't really talk about the substance of God without also immediately talking about the persons. Talking about the substance means talking about Father, Son, and Spirit together. On Saturday, I unpacked that, and I could do that if you're interested in hearing more. I unpacked that a little bit in terms of, maybe I did or didn't, I don't know. I did this recently in the last week somewhere on this continent. Unpacked it in terms of the attributes of God. So the attributes of God are attributes of this triune communion. If the essence of God is his existence, and his existence is existence as Father, Son, and Spirit, then when we talk about God's attributes, they are attributes of that triune communion and life. They're not attributes of the underlying divine substance, because there is no such thing. They're attributes of that divine life. So love is an attribute not of bare divinity, it's an attribute of Father, Son, and Spirit in their eternal communion. Righteousness and justice is an attribute of that eternal communion, and so on. So that kind of deflects and overcomes some of the important objections that have been raised about divine substance in the last 50 years or so. That's certainly not a Hellenized way of speaking about substance, and it's also not a way of speaking about substance that lends itself to the problems that are sometimes, the questions that are sometimes raised about substance. What about person? What can we say about person? And particularly here, the question is it, what is the question is whether we can attribute personality in the modern sense of the term to the divine persons. Or are we simply saying that the divine persons are individual instances of divine nature? To assert personality in a strong sense would again be to say that they are capable of communion and communication. They are have a certain kind of intention and will, perhaps a certain degree of self-consciousness. Sometimes personhood is defined in those terms. A capacity, at least, to enter into I-thou relationships. You can have inanimate objects, impersonal objects, that are in certain kinds of relations with one another. Table, tripod, camera, those are relations that they have with one another. The tripod is on the table and the camera is attached to the tripod. Talking about you, camera. So you have relations there, spatial relations, but those aren't personal relations. The table is not entering into communion with the tripod, as attached as the tripod does seem to be to the table at the moment. They're not in any kind of personal communion. There's no I-thou relationship. My relationship with the camera is a fraught relationship, but my relationship with the camera is an I-it relationship. Yeah. Remember that. It's an I-it relationship. It's just a thing. I can manipulate, I can move it around. It would be a very different kind of relationship than one I would have with you. If I tried to treat one of you the way I'm treating the camera right now, that would be very rude. It would be very unconscient to treat you as somehow instrumental to my ends rather than an end in yourself. So I should treat you in an I-thou relationship as something other than an object. Okay. So when you say that do the persons have personality, that's one of the things we're asking. Do the persons have personality in the sense that they are having this I-thou relationship with one another? Not just individual instances, but individual instances of divine nature that somehow can commune and communicate with one another. One of the strongest cases for saying saying yes to that question, that the divine persons have relationality and personality in a strong sense, comes from a Greek Orthodox theologian named John Zizioulas. 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 Zizioulas, his major book is Being as Communion. And in that book he develops a partly historical case for saying that personality or relationality is in a strong sense is characteristic of the divine persons. and partly a theological case, unpacking some of the implications of that for our understanding of being as such, existence as such, not just divine existence, but existence as such. And then he does adds some things about how that unfolds in Orthodox ecclesiology, and how we're to understand the nature of the church in the light of this relational understanding. His argument is that the Cappadocians, which are, again, the Eastern theologians in the 4th century, they're active primarily after the Council of Nicaea, and they elaborated the Council of Nicaea, defended the Council of Nicaea, and constructed, worked out the vocabulary for Trinitarian theology that's dominated Greek-speaking Christian theology since, and translated, imported into the West through Latin and then into other Western languages. So the Cappadocians, he says, revolutionized metaphysics. There's a philosophical revolution that takes place when the Cappadocians begin to unpack Trinitarian theology. They're using Greek categories. They're using philosophical terms and categories that pre-existed Trinitarian theology, but they begin to use them in very different ways than they had been used before. One example of what Zizioulas is getting at is what I said earlier about hypostasis. Hypostasis is the term, remember, that originally means substance or essence. In earlier Greek theologians, earlier than the Cappadocians would have said God is one hypostasis. It's talking about the essence or substance of a thing. That switches over to a description of the person. And Zizioulas thinks that that's not just a shift in the terminology, but that indicates a shift in perspective. So you're taking this term that has enormous ontological weight. It's the term you use when you want to describe what a thing is in its most essential nature, and then you use that same term with this weighty ontological connotations, and you begin to describe the divine persons using that term. He says that's quite different from Greek philosophy prior to this development in Trinitarian theology. For the Greeks, relationality, personality was not ontologically weighty. It was some addition to your underlying reality. You're most basically something that's not personal and not related. That's what you most basically are. And then relations are ontologically secondary or not ontologically significant at all. So you have, consider this pigeon Greek philosophy, not actual Greek philosophy. But this is just to illustrate with a really bad example what I'm talking about. Okay, I'm unmarried. I get married and enter into a new kind of relationship with my wife. But that relationship doesn't define me. Fundamentally, I am still the unmarried me that I was before. Okay, that relationship is external to who and what I actually am. Again, I don't think Greek philosophers would say that, but that's just a way of illustrating what Zizioulas is getting at when he says that personality is secondary, ontologically secondary. It's added to a more basic essence rather than having full ontological weight, rather than describing what the thing actually is. He says partly in this shift in the use of the word hypostasis, you see this philosophical revolution when the Cappadocians use the word prosopon, which I mentioned earlier. When they use that to describe the three persons, they're again filling that term with unprecedented ontological weight. So it originally means mask. The prosopon means mask or face or appearance, which would in Greek philosophy would just be the external visibility of something, the sensible reality of something. It wouldn't necessarily reveal the actual essence or substance of a thing. And if it's a mask, then it's actually hiding what the thing is. A prosopon or an actor is a mask that's hiding his face. But then the Cappadocians begin to use that term which describes this very external kind of identity to describe the divine persons, and they fill that term with, as I said, unprecedented ontological weight, so that the Father becomes identified as Father, the Son identified as Son, not just wearing that mask, but that is, in fact, who he is. So you begin to use these relational terms, or these terms that indicate appearance, and you use them to describe the actual nature, character, the persons of God. And that, he says, raises relationality from something that's secondary in Greek philosophy to something that's fundamental. Being is communion, he concludes. That's the title of his book. Being is communion, or being as communion is the title, but he asserts that being is communion. It's not as if God first is, and then he enters into relations. God is as a communion of persons in relation. And he goes on to unpack that in terms of anthropology and, again, in terms of ecclesiology, not always in a satisfying way, to my mind, but he does unpack that as trying to apply that to human life. So if being is communion for God, God makes us in his image, then relationality for human beings is not some secondary factor in our lives, but it's definitive of who we are. We're created not just with the capacity for relationship, but created to be relational beings in our most basic existence or essence. That's the kind of creatures that we are. Related ultimately to God, related also to one another, so that, Zizius says, this means that God the Father and God the Son enter into I-thou relationships. They are in an eternal I-thou relationship. They love one another in the Spirit. They know one another in this communion of intimate knowledge that is that they open up to us, but is eternally their own intimate knowledge of one another. And God himself is this interpersonal communion. Zizius' historical claim. Let me. I'll get to that. Zizius' historical claim has been challenged. The Cappadocians didn't really mean person in this sense. It's been said the Cappadocians really didn't perform this philosophical revolution that Zizius suggests. A recent article by Khaled Anatolios, Anatolios, in a book called The Trinity in the Life of the Church. Khaled Anatolios is a Eastern Rite Catholic theologian, teaches now at Notre Dame University. It's a church that's associated with the Bishop of Rome, but its worship is Orthodox worship. And anything you read by Anatolios is worth reading. He's written a wonderful book on Nicaea, Retrieving Nicaea. But he's written a recent article that's responding to this debate, whether Zizius is correct about the Cappadocian revolution in ontology, whether person in a strong sense is applicable to the divine persons. And he, I think, makes a superb case for a somewhat more modest thesis historically than Zizius. He admits that the Cappadocians used the terminology of personality differently than we do in the modern world. But he says that doesn't mean that there isn't any continuity at all between the way the Cappadocians use the terminology and the way we do. They could be using it differently and yet begin a process of reflection that leads into what we think of as personality. And he argues that he doesn't present a case for that, but he does say that there's no, even if the terminology is used differently in different phases, different times of history, that doesn't mean there's not a continuity between them. And he defends these three theses. And he claims that these are the Cappadocian positions. The Father, Son, and Spirit are agents of mutually referring speech acts. Mutually referring speech acts. Each of the persons can say I. Each of the persons addresses the others as you. This is clearest in the Father-Son relationship, refer to John 17 again. Jesus is praying to his Father and talks about the glory that he once had with his Father from all eternity, and speaks of his intimate relationship with the Father, his perichoretic relationship with the Father. I in you, thou in me. Jesus can address his Father as thou. He can speak of himself as I. And the relationship between the Father and the Son is a relationship of I and thou that is carried out in terms of speech acts. They speak to one another. They converse with one another. They look like persons when they do that, rather than like the table and the tripod, which are not speaking to one another, even though they're in a spatial relationship to each other. The Father and the Son look like they're persons, and Tertullius, I think, rightly is saying that they are. It says each person possesses, this again is what he says is the Cappadocian position, each person possesses intentionality and agency within the unified agency of Trinitarian coactivity. So each person has a will, even if we say there's one divine will, but that we've already seen from the Thomas Aquinas argument that anything we say about the oneness of God, about the substance of God, is triunely expressed. So even if there's one divine will, that's diversely expressed by Father, Son, and Spirit, and it's in their different agencies that the one acts of God and the one will of God exist. And then he says the persons enjoy a personal communication that can be appropriately characterized as a perichoretic circle of delight and mutual glorification. And I think the crucial point that Anatolius makes is this, and I'm not saying this, don't want to get into deep discussion of Anatolius' position, but the crucial point is this. He says, we have to do nothing less than jettison the intelligibility of the biblical narrative if we're not willing to accept that Father, Son, and Spirit are agents of conversation. If we're going to let the Trinitarian economy lead us into God's very being, we have to conceive the Trinitarian persons as agents of speech and conceive of Trinitarian communion as a conversation between Father and Son through the Spirit. So one of his tests for all of this is what do the Scriptures lead us to believe about the interrelation of Father and Son, and the Father, Son, and Spirit? What does the gospel narrative and its narrative of Jesus' relationship with his Father lead us to believe is the case with the ontological Trinity? You notice he's moving there from the Trinitarian economy, where the Father sends the Son into the world and the Father and Son send the Spirit. That's the economy that he's talking about. And that economy leads us into God's very being. And if we take the economy as a path into knowing the God as he actually is, then we have to say that Father, Son, and Spirit are in personal communion with one another. Let me point to one passage of Scripture that then I'll take a few questions. And then we'll move into lectures 4 and 5. No, lectures 3 and 4 in 1 hour. I think I can do that. Psalm 110. And I'm going to, it's a well-known psalm that Jesus himself quotes and stymies his Jewish opponents. And I'm going to take on the persona, or the mask of a patristic interpreter, and read this the way that I think the church fathers would have. And the church fathers did cite this. The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make thine enemies a footstool for thy feet. The Lord will stretch forth thy strong scepter from Zion, saying, rule in the midst of thine enemies. Thy people will volunteer freely on the day of power in holy array from the womb of the dawn. Thy youth are to thee as the dew. Okay. And the first verse particularly is where we want to focus. The Lord says to my Lord. That passage is quoted a number of times in the New Testament. Again, Jesus quotes it himself. But it's alluded to or quoted as a reference, in reference to the Father and the Son. This is, as Jesus points out when he quotes this passage, this is David speaking, David is speaking about the Christ, according to Jesus. And Jesus asks, how can the Christ be David's son if David also calls the Christ his Lord? So the my Lord in the first line of the psalm, according to Jesus' reading, which I think is pretty reliable, the my Lord must be the Christ. But that means, and of course the question for the Jews is, how can David refer to one of his descendants, which would presumably be somebody subordinate to him, somebody who comes after him and is beneath him, beyond him, below him? How can he refer to him as my Lord? And if this is the Christ, then what we have here is Yahweh. That's the first word is all caps, so that's Yahweh. Yahweh says to my Lord. David is speaking. So it's not Yahweh speaking to David, it's Yahweh speaking to David's Lord, who is the Christ. So what we have here is a bit of communication that Jesus says is communication from the Lord to the Christ, from God to the Christ. We would use the terminology from father to son. A bit of communication that's delivered by David. David somehow overhears this. And this is the father and son speaking ahead of time to one another, the father speaking to the son ahead of time, before the time when he actually grants him the throne that he's going to grant him. It's a conversation or a bit of conversation that is revealed to David so that David can deliver it, and then it's fulfilled as the New Testament describes. So this is an Old Testament example, or an Old Testament text that shows us the intercommunication between father and son. Shows us that they are I thou, that the Lord the Father can sit the Lord the Christ at his right hand, that the Lord the Father can speak of I doing something to make the Christ's enemies a footstool for the Christ's feet. They're speaking, the Father speaking to the Son, the Father is giving favor to the Son, the Father is promising the Son victory over his enemies, and promising the Son that his enemies will become a footstool for him. The New Testament readings of passages like this, and later patristic readings, see these passages and passages similar to this as passages that are disclosing to us inner Trinitarian communication. You find this in Justin Martyr, you find it in Athanasius. Sometimes it's David himself or a prophet speaking, but they claim that when the prophet speaks, it's actually the Logos, the eternal Logos, speaking. And so in the persona of the prophet or in the persona of David, the eternal Logos, the Son, is speaking to his Father. Here we have a case where the Father is quite directly speaking to his Son. And we have already in the Old Testament, we have this revelation of a God of the God in whom there is this eternal conversation, this promises, commitments made, honor promised, and later conferred in the exaltation of Jesus. So that's just one little glimpse of a case that can be made for what Anatolius and Zizioulas are talking about, and the fact that the divine persons are being presented as persons in the strong sense of the term, that they actually are in these I-thou relationships of conversation and speech, relationships of giving and receiving, relationships of commitments, promises made and promises kept, and those kinds of relations characterize the internal relations of the triune persons. Got a minute? Any quick questions? It would take a few minutes beyond the actual break time if you want to talk about something. Yes, sir.
Thanks. I can't get this phrase re-evangelizing messages out of my head. It seems to me that some of the most interesting theology is coming out of the moment of sort of what you might call the atheistic secular left. And that really intrigues me. try and pick one example and see what you think about it. So, people might read, as I take Zazula's to read Heidegger and Buber and all these guys, quite deeply, and maybe he's re-evangelizing them. Someone like Levinas would say that when we dismiss, say, Hannah as not being capable of an ideal relationship, we're kind of silencing him. Levinas gives this story of a dog in a concentration camp called Bobby. And he says, when I think of Bobby, I think of the last Kantian in Germany. He said, who treated me like a human being. And so, is there some way of saying, can we see the face of God in the face of a dog like Bobby?
Without being dyslexic, you mean?
Right, yeah. Do you see the kind of question I'm getting at? How far
Yes.
do we go with that?
I understand what you're doing. You want me to apologize to the camera? I'm sorry. I will apologize. Yeah, that's a very good point. What's that?
I was watching you the whole time. I never lied. And you treated me like that.
No, I don't mean to.
So it's a counterfeit personality that kind of
Right.
So I don't know.
I don't want to dismiss your question. It's a really good question. I got carried away talking to the camera. I'm sorry. The question is, should we? Is it really correct to say that we have these I-it relationships and that there's not any kind of I-thou that's going on within what we're thinking of as an I-it relationship? Is that? Yeah, I think that's. I think I would qualify what I have been saying with something like that, and I'll explain it in a couple of ways. In terms of it's not to defend what I had said, but in terms of Zizioulas does reserve I-thou relationships to interpersonal relationships, and I think that's one of the oddities of what he sets up is that it doesn't seem that personality really comes into play for him outside of incorporation into divine life. So what are human beings prior to that? There's a quality of impersonality even to human beings outside of that, and I think there's a problem with understanding of creation there, and I would agree with you in a couple of ways. On the more theological side, everything that we encounter is from God. God hasn't simply placed it there for us to encounter, but God is somehow present in and with our encounter with that thing. So in that sense, yes, no relationship is outside of that I-thou relationship with God, even our relationships with inanimate things. Have a great deal of instinctive sympathy with the romantics who can look at a landscape and say that they're communing with God by contemplating the beauty of the landscape. I wouldn't reserve it to unspoiled creation. I think I can look at certain kind of technical achievements and say that there's a certain kind of glory and something about God's character that's being reflected in those technological achievements. That's not just these are communicating something about God, but God is present and active in that. So that would be one part of it. The other part is the kind of the terminology that you get from phenomenology, which I think has some value to it. The notion that even inanimate objects are involved in a kind of self-presentation, that we encounter a rock because the rock presents itself as rock to us. And they're not attributing intentionality or consciousness to the rock, but just in the fact that it's visible, there is a kind of presentation or giving, almost the rock is given to us or gives itself to us. And that's hard to make sense of when you put that into an atheistic or non-theistic context. But when you put that into a theistic context, then it does make some sense that God's creations are given to us as words to us. Day-to-day ports forth speak, night and night speak knowledge. Heavens declare the glory of God. So there's a self-presentation of God's created things to us that communicates to us something about God. So yeah, I apologize to the camera. You had a question, yes?
Yeah. I think in my neck of the woods, the biggest struggle people have with the presentation of the Trinity is its gender nature.
Yeah.
And I guess our traditional response to that has been to appeal to the substances of God as beyond gender. Just kind of your reflections on that, given what you've just said.
Yeah.
And also, is it just a matter of revelation, and that still doesn't get us off the hook? It still sounds very patriarchal.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'll try to respond to that. I don't know that I'll relieve all the concerns. The question has to do with the masculine language of Father, Son, Spirit, the implied patriarchalism of that name of God, and your initial response was, or initial statement was that one way to deal with that is to say that the essence of God is beyond gender, but I've kind of spoiled that argument by saying the essence of God is nothing other than the Father, Son, Spirit in their eternal relations. And I wouldn't want to locate any kind of response in some kind of unhypothesized essence anyway. Even if you don't buy the Aquinas argument, there is no essence of God that's not personalized as Father, Son, and Spirit. So you're left with that same problem regardless, I think. And if you begin to talk about an essence beyond the three persons, then you really are in some kind of mystical territory that is you're no longer operating in Orthodox Trinitarian categories, I don't think. I see a couple of things more positively in response. One is the Father, Son, and Spirit I take to be a name of God, as Robert Jensen and others have argued. I think that's exegetically sound in places like Matthew 28, baptized into the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The way that Father, Son, Holy Spirit comes into benedictions. You're blessed in the Aaronic benediction by Yahweh, and then in Paul's benedictions, the name that is placed on people is Father, Son, and Spirit. So if it's a name, then it's not a description of attributes, which means that some kind of adjustment to less overtly masculine terminology is not really viable. I also think that some of the efforts to do that end up being essentially modalist rather than Trinitarian. I said I was going to give a positive response, but that was still pretty critical. So how do we make sense of the fact that human beings are made in the image of God as male and female? That women are made in the image of God as well as men, and yet speak of Father, Son, and Spirit as the name of God. One way to explore that would be to explore relations within the triune life that are uncreated archetypes or exemplars of the relations of masculine and feminine in creation, of male and female in creation. I think I have a chapter in my book on this. This will sell the book. I have a chapter in my book on the Trinity on sex. And I'm talking about sex in terms of as an image of perichoresis, I think a very kind of one of the clearest, most direct, most physical kind of images that we have. If you want mutual indwelling, you've got in sexual in a sexual intercourse, you have the male and female mutually enveloping and indwelling one another and forming one flesh. So there's a kind of union that's possible only because you have both male and female. That's more a Bardian kind of twist, because Bard talks about male and female together imaging God. But it does mean that Adam, as such, is somehow an incomplete, before Eve was created, somehow incomplete image of divine life. And with the woman becomes a more completed image. So that would be one kind of direction to go, would be to think about how. Here's another example that would along the same lines or along similar lines. Paul says that the husband is head of the wife as Christ is head of the church. And so there's a relationship of headship and submission in marriage, Ephesians 5. Now, can we find something of that? And when Paul talks about the analogy is between Christ and the church, but can we find something of that headship and submission that's characteristic of the divine life itself, so that in some sense there's a masculine, feminine kind of relationship between the Father and the Son. And I think that's the case. I think insofar as headship and submission headship has to do with initiative, the head is the one who goes first. The Father is the one who begets the Son submits to the Father. The Son's whole life is to do the will of his Father. The Son's sonship, he is nothing but Son, and his sonship is nothing but doing the will of his Father. So there's a within that relationship that is a relationship as a father and son, so it's masculine, but there is a kind of feminine responsiveness in the Son's relationship to the Father. So that would be another kind of direction to explore. The other thing that, another passage that might, again, reflect on similar kinds of concerns. 1 Corinthians 11, Paul has this ascending kind of hierarchy. This goes into talking about head coverings. I'm not going to talk about that. But verse 2 of 1 Corinthians 11 says, "Now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firmly the traditions just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man. The man is the head of a woman. God is the head of Christ." So the God-Christ relationship is analogous to the man-woman relationship. That's what I've just said, reasoning from Ephesians 5. But then further down, verse 6, "If a woman does not cover her head, let her also have her hair cut off. It is disgraceful for a woman. If it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off, or to have her head shaved, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to have his head covered, since he is the image and glory of God. But the woman is the glory of man." So there's this relationship between God and the image and glory that is the man, and the man in his image and glory is the woman. So that's not a interdivine relationship, but we can bring in other New Testament passages. Hebrews 1. God is the Son is the exact image and representation of the Father. Man is made in the image as the image of glory of God, after the pattern of the original image and glory of God, which is the Son, and the analogy to that is the man and the woman relationship. So there's again a God, a father, son, man, woman kind of analogy going on there. So all of that those are different ways of coming at or exploring the general point which I suggested, which is that relations between masculine and feminine relations have some divine root in the father-son relationship. That would be a way to explore it. That by no means relieves all the difficulties and tensions, but there'd be other ways to go about that. But pneumatology is one of the options historically. There's some ways of speaking about this historically in the tradition. There's ways of speaking about the Spirit that associate the Spirit with femininity.